This subject, which was also our subject last week, is probably the most fundamental on the spiritual path, and at the same time is so delicate and subtle. It's like it's completely obvious, and yet until you see it, you can't see it at all. Swamiji has recently, Swami Kriyananda, who's the founder of Ananda, has talked a lot recently in this way, talking about what the ego is. Ego is a very complicated word when you get on the spiritual path, because there's a great deal of just sort of common conversation, which is not entirely accurate, where ego is the big enemy. And we're always talking about the need to overcome the ego, and the ego got in the way, and it's just my ego, and words like that, which are all true, but they don't necessarily clarify what it is that we're actually struggling with. And sometimes it just essentially puts us at war with ourselves. A friend of mine was having a difficult time with willpower, and she was trying to speak really sternly about how she just had to get herself in hand, and she was going to do this, and she had to, and it was just this huge, intense energy, and I kept trying to interrupt her. And she was telling me, I know what you're going to say. I said, you have no idea what I'm going to say. I said, because she thought I was going to tell her, oh, it's not so important, just let it pass, that I didn't agree with the need for willpower in that circumstance. I said, no. I said, but I have never seen it serve your well-being when you divide yourself against yourself. And I realized later that I think my friend was raised by a very stern parent. And that parent was always scolding like this and telling them to be different. And my friend had integrated into her own awareness this sort of sense of, I myself am my own enemy. But it's a very, very difficult way to live, because we're both in there. And if one of us is the enemy and one of us is the friend, then we're always feeling fractured. And it's not really at all what is intended by the spiritual teaching, that we have to overcome our ego. And that's why Master's teaching, Yogananda's teaching on this vine and the husband, and the Master Jesus' teaching is so much more subtle about talking about it. Master himself, Yogananda, says that he defines ego as the infinite soul identified with the physical body. It's a really amazing definition when you really reflect on it, and it's worth taking into your meditation and taking into your contemplation for a really long time, because it's to say that we are always the infinite spirit, but when we incarnate in this body, when we find ourselves responsible for this one little form, which happens when we're little babies, we find ourselves responsible. And all of a sudden we're working through these fingers and this mouth and these toes, and you watch little babies gradually figure out how to make that whole system work. And it takes all their time and attention to make that system work. It's a really big job for babies to get it figured out. And it's only natural, finding ourselves in this one body, finding ourselves incapable really of influencing any of the others. We can't will other fingers to grab for us. We can't will other mouths to satisfy our hunger, that we gradually begin to think, well, this must be me, because this is where my perceptions take place. We identify then with the world as we view it through the senses and as we experience it with the body, and the memory, which admittedly sometimes is a very distant memory from our divine origin, the memory of ourselves as we really are just fades away from lack of use, from lack of attention. So the ego becomes deeply identified with this body and then everything that goes with it. And everything that goes with it is that I am singular, that I am separate, that I am intensely vulnerable, that I depend on food, that I must earn money, that I can be lonely, that I die, that I age. If you think about all these things, then you add to it the subconscious stored in the chakras memory of all the other bodies that you've been identified with, and all the other experiences that came from those bodies, whether they're positive and you meet someone and you have an instant karmic recognition because you spent lives together, or you see a ship and a body of water and you suddenly become terrified over some memory of death and dying, whatever it might be. And all of those previous identifications recorded in the chakras are all part of the soul identifying with what turns out to be a series of physical bodies. So Swami Kriyananda has just refined that a little further by saying the ego is nothing but a bundle of identifications, of self-definitions, of self-identifications. This is who I am. Now, what's so interesting and fabulous about this is that all it is a question of what we've identified with. You see? It's never a question of what we actually are. It's merely a question of what we have thought ourselves to be. How many fairy tales are there and stories there are that are all based on some misidentification? The Prince and the Pauper is a wonderful story where there's a pauper and a prince and they happen to look just alike and they get switched. And the prince is out there and he's among all the poor people and he starts telling them that I'm the prince. And all of his erstwhile cronies just consider him mad and they tease him and they joke with him. And the poor pauper finds himself in the palace. And in fact, they switched places deliberately but didn't realize they were going to get stuck. The pauper keeps telling everyone, I'm just a poor person, I'm not the king. And gradually it has to sort itself out. Or the swan that thinks itself to be the ugly duckling and is not until it grows up and sees what it's become. The lion cub that lives among sheep. I mean, all of these images are told because of their deeper significance. They make good stories, and they make good stories because some part of us resonates with that. We all have, however deeply buried it might be, this subconscious memory. And maybe it's closer to the surface that somehow this that I'm doing is not really me. I belong somewhere else. And how often children dream, especially if they're not happy with their circumstances, that someday somebody's going to come and recognize me and realize that I really am the king or the Empress of Russia or whatever it might be. You know, the long-lost Anastasia is actually me and so on. Because in truth it is, you see. And the whole project of the spiritual path is to identify with our true reality. I mean, there's so many ways to say it that are not really very complex in themselves. We merely need to shift our identity. And if we really look at all spiritual practices, that's really what they're designed to do, is to shift our identity to something else. Now, then it gets a little complicated because it's not as if we shift our identity by becoming passive. And this is where the example of the saints and the masters really have to be studied very carefully. When I first came on the spiritual path when I was 18 years old, and I first heard about this concept of self-realization and this idea of a greater reality, after I studied a little bit of philosophy, I started reading the lives of the saints. I started reading the Hindu epics about Rama and Sita and Krishna and Arjuna and all of those great heroes. And then I just started reading books about saints, as many as I could find from as many different traditions as there were available to me at that point, because I was trying to figure out, okay, here's the principle, but what does it look like when it's lived? And there's one quality that is uniformly shared by all true masters or true saints, and that is this extraordinarily dynamic sense of willpower and courage. Of course, the greatest examples we have are Yogananda himself and then Swami Kriyananda, who's still living, whom many of us know and have seen and watched him act. Swami Kriyananda, who's now 83 years old, just published his 102nd book. Actually, 101, he kind of leaped over. 101 is still in process. He's working, he just published number 102. And these are not, some of them are smaller books, but these are by no means trivial books. Books on the commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, commentary on the Bible, his own autobiography, stories of his life with his master. I mean, these are big books, and he didn't start writing when he was 1 either. You know, he started well into his life. He was in his, actually he finished The Path, which was his really first major book on his 50th birthday. So, I mean, just the picture of what that's about. Now, there's two things that are involved here. One is how much energy you have to put out on the spiritual path. Because what we're doing in a very real sense is this ego has a lot of suction. It's like a cork really buried in a wine bottle. And it doesn't just come out by our saying, oh, I think I'll identify with the infinite spirit. You know? It's like there's all this grip, these years and years, I mean, generations, incarnations of habit that's just got a real grip on that. And even though some little fragment of our nature is now conscious of this infinite, there's all this holding here. So that what the effort of the spiritual path is just to extricate our soul from that habit. Now, in theory, and I always love this is what I focused on mostly when I was 18, was this particular theory, that transference can happen in a second. Because all we're doing is waking up. And when you're dead asleep, just totally asleep, and you wake up, from 1 minute to sleep to wakefulness is just a transfer just like that, isn't it? In fact, I loved reading when I was younger that they said sometimes enlightenment will come to you while you're sleeping. And so I would always go to bed hoping to be enlightened when I woke up. A friend of mine, Swamiji teaches us, as Master teaches, that there's 3 basic states of consciousness. Subconscious, which is all of our buried memories. It's the power of our karmic memories in our chakras. People use subconscious psychologically, but this is a bigger definition. Everything that is buried in us and compels us, but that we're not completely conscious of. Then there's the conscious level of awareness, which is where we're mostly in now, but the conscious is very strongly influenced by the subconscious, all that identification. Then there's the superconscious, which is ourselves in touch with the infinite. Well, one of my early mentors on the spiritual path he was a very, very good sleeper. He could conscientiously sleep many, many hours every day, especially when he had things to do he wanted to procrastinate. So he used to say, well, there's 3 states of consciousness and I have mastered 1. So he felt that he was 1/3 of the way there. Of course, he was only joking. But when we're asleep and then we're awake, it just happens just like that, doesn't it? Because, you see, the sense of identification is nothing but a habit, and a habit is a vortex of energy created around a center point, and literally in the chakras, chakra means wheel. So within the chakras, we have these fixed points, and we rotate a lot of energy around them. Every time we identify with our body because the finger is cut and it feels painful, the body is hungry and it needs to eat, it's cold, it needs to put on a wrap, it's afraid and so it shudders about this. All of these different ways, we're rotating energy around this central point, and that creates magnetism. And that's the cork stuck in the bottle, like this. It's the magnetism of our own repeated actions. Because it's just energy, there's no fixed point. You don't have to pick up a lot of rocks and move them from one place to another. It's not physical, it's just energy. And energy, if you think of it like a river flowing and a whirlpool, which is exactly what it is, the river's flowing this way, the whirlpool sucks the energy. If that river goes into flood, all those whirlpools are just swept into it and just cease to exist, don't they? So if there's more energy going towards your goal than away from it, then all those vortices are just sucked in. So in theory, in one moment, it can all be shifted. But of course, you have to put out enough energy in that moment to equal all the other energy you've put in. And sometimes that does happen. I recall a very moving story of a man, and I've told it here before, who was being tortured when he was a POW in Vietnam. And he was pushed. He was a man of faith in God, but he was pushed so far. Finally, one day, he just essentially broke through and just had this realization of the presence of God in his life and his unity with Christ, which was the image that he loved. And in that sense of complete unity, he just lost concern for the body. And the fact that it was being tortured or not tortured, it just didn't mean anything to him anymore because he was no longer identified with that experience. Now, the energy that he had to put out was so great because of the energy pushing against him that he burst through and had this utterly life-changing experience. But for most people, even though those incidences come, and we're, as devotees, we all have had those moments where in the presence of great saints, in a moment of deep contemplation, the accumulated effort of our own, we reach the tipping point, whatever it might be, we'll suddenly know something. I remember that I struggled for years with an antipathy toward one of my gurubhais, one of my fellow disciples. It was a karmic antipathy, and I struggled with it for decades, really. And then one day, I said to myself, I think you enjoy being angry about this. It was the first time I'd been willing to admit it. You know, until that time, I was always self-righteous and felt justified. And then one day I said, you know, you like feeling justified. It gives you a little sense of power, doesn't it? And in the moment that I realized that, I thought, I really don't want this. And decades of antipathy just dissolved, just went away. Now, that's the tipping point that was made up of the real way that we progress spiritually, which is a moment-by-moment effort at all times to see ourselves in relationship to a higher truth. And the problem with the spiritual path is it looks really exciting and romantic and full of bells and whistles and all these things when we start. We hear about enlightenment and we have people tell us about this great thing here and this great thing there, and it's definitely very attractive. But the actual reality of it is one foot in front of the other. I've always had a great affection for mountain climbing accounts. I think I'm finally used up on it, but I've read many, many accounts of scaling Annapurna or Kilimanjaro or Everest over and over again about Everest expeditions. And the comparison to the spiritual path is really in many ways quite vivid, except for, well, there's one thing, which is for them it gets worse and worse the closer they get to the top. And for devotees it gets better and better the closer you get to the top. It's not an all or nothing. But there's a point that sets in, especially in those Everest expeditions, as I've read about it, where because of the oxygen deprivation and all the things that happen, the actual effort, literally just to put one foot in front of the other, and then just to put the next foot there, and then the next foot. They describe it, it takes every ounce of their willpower and concentration. And that's why sometimes they'll quit, you know, just within sight of the summit. And when they get back down to the flatlands and their body and brains recover, they can't understand why they weren't able to finish. But in the moment, they simply didn't have the willpower to finish. Now, in the Bhagavad Gita, there's a very discouraging statement, which is, first of all, Krishna says, out of 1,000 in the world, only one person seeks God. And out of 1,000 who seek God, only one person finds. You know, so you start looking around and wonder whether you're the 999 or the one, you know, of the people in the room. Paramahansa Yogananda very sweetly said, on this path our percentage is higher. Like that. This is a special dispensation right now, which is something worth noting. That was exactly what he called it. This is a special dispensation because we're breaking new ground. I would like to say our percentage is much higher, but it really makes no difference at all. Because whether we're that 1 or that 50 or that 999 who actually make it and the only one who fails is 1, it doesn't make any difference. Because for us, it's putting one foot in front of the other. And where people lose heart on the spiritual path, it oddly enough is not usually in the big tests. Somehow when even tragedy and enormous challenge, you just have to face it. There's nothing you can do. You're being pushed so hard, you have to do something. Where people really lose heart is day after day after day. And we become sort of, the phrase I use is middle-aged about our spiritual path. And I often, not often, because as soon as I hear it, I do my best to muffle, to put a sock in the mouth of whoever is speaking. But sometimes I'll hear people say, oh yeah, when I first came, I felt like that. And I'll think, oh, you poor soul. I was at Ananda Village this last weekend, as many of you were, for 4th of July celebration, and we have this song, "Many hands make a miracle. Let's all join hands together and then raise our hands and welcome the sun like this." And there's a certain point in this, I'm such a sap. There's a certain point in the song, and we reach over, and then we all raise our hands. And every single time, I am so enthusiastic to hold hands and raise my hands. I think, how many times have I done this? And I think I'll say it's a gift, because from very early on the spiritual path, Swamiji has asked me to introduce others to the path. And so I'm always getting to tell someone for the first time about this, what it means to meditate and what it means to have a guru, and about the Ananda community. And I just can get so excited. And then I see it through the eyes of people who are starting completely new. So I've been very fortunate in that the enthusiasm I have for every little thing about this spiritual path is exactly the same as it was when I first came. Well, that's not true. It's infinitely greater. Because after all these years, I really understand on a much deeper level what it is we have, although I was pretty sure of it when I started. The biggest danger in our spiritual path is really not our terrible mistakes, it's our indifference. That's an expression of Master's. He says, God does not mind your failings. What he minds is your indifference. The only thing that matters is that we keep trying. And it really doesn't matter how many times we fail. When the cork is in the bottle, or the image that they often use is if there's a nail in the wall and you have to pull that nail out, you don't know if you didn't drive it in or don't remember driving it in. You don't know whether it's a 12-inch nail or a half-inch nail. And so you keep pulling and you don't know how close it is to finally coming out. And the only thing you can do is, if you're going to remove it, is you just have to keep tugging. And if you strain your arm, or if you get tired, or if you become utterly overcome with despair at the effort of pulling the nail out and collapse at the bottom of the wall and weep for lifetimes, sooner or later you're going to have to stand up and start pulling on the nail again, because it's going to have to come out. Because the soul will never rest until it has overcome this limited identification and is back into that unified reality. Nothing will satisfy us. We will try and try and try and try and try and try and try, and all sorts of things hold us: fame, name, laziness, fear, physical weakness, physical pain, all sorts of things convince us that we have to stay in the bottle. The cork has to stay in. And above all, what convinces us is what I call the preference for the known misery. It's cramped and it's a little dark in here, but, it's my home. I'm familiar with it. And then there's this slight promise of something better. But what we have to do on a daily basis, and the battle is won and lost in the moments. That's why Yogananda said, take care of the minutes, and incarnations will take care of themselves. In other words, there's never such a thing as a time when it doesn't matter. Now, don't therefore think that every time you have a bad thought, or a wrong thought, or a weak thought, then that's it between you and God. He's going to just throw you overboard. That's just not true. But what we have to constantly cultivate is our desire to be better. And that's why devotion on the spiritual path is so profoundly important. I've talked about this many times recently. If we love something, we don't have to work hard to want to go toward it. And that's why Master has prayer and chanting and these beautiful whispers from eternity. And that's why we come together as often as we can, so that we will reawaken that feeling in the heart. Because we don't really understand by figuring it out. We can figure it out to a certain point, but until the heart grasps the reality of it, we really think much more with our hearts than we do with our heads. And all of you are sitting in here because at some point, either with great fervor or with just some slight feeling, or up and down and all of those, at some point your heart cried out and it said, "Oh Lord, help. rescue me from this. Just like my little friend at 5 years old who wrote a letter to God, sealed it up, gave it to her mother, and the mother opened it naturally, and it said, "God, get me out of here." Don't you feel like that? One of my favorite Piglet stories, Piglet and Pooh, they're lost in the fog. Of course, they're just yards away from safety, but they're lost in the fog. And poor Piglet, Pooh is being very efficient. Everybody's trying to figure out how to get them out of the fog. And Piglet just puts his head down like this in total despair. And then all he can think of to do every once in a while is he goes, "Help, help, help!" That's all that's required. Really. Because that is an indication of where your aspiration is. And a recognition that you know that there is somebody out there who's going to listen to you. And if you don't even know, that you hope there's someone out there who's going to listen to you. The only time that we have lost, and even then we've just put ourselves on pause, the tape is still in there frozen, like the DVD image. That's what we do. Every so often on our spiritual path, we just put pause. I'm not going to try. I'm not going to do anything. We just sit there for a while, until the heart just can't stand it anymore. And then at least we say, "Help!" Even if we go back. But as long as a part of us is always aware that I may be totally identified with this horrible moment, but I'm only identified with it. I haven't become it. Because always there is this reality that I have seen. This is where you get to these incredibly, by now, trivialized spiritual practices. Make a list of everything that you're grateful for. Every day, count your blessings. Well, those are extremely serious, absolutely deadly serious ideas. Because every time the mind says, "Oh, it's not going the way I want, I don't like what's happening to me," we're just denying that relationship. This power that we are, you see, is pure love. This unconditional love of God. But God, because He loves us, He wants that cork out of the bottle. Just like a little child says, "I don't have to go to school anymore, Mommy. I'll just stay here with you. I don't really have to go. My teacher's kind of icky. I'll just stay here." And the mother who allows that to happen destroys the life of the child. That's not love. God loves us. Rats is what you have to say sometimes. Mother Teresa said, "God never gives us more than we can handle, but sometimes I wish He didn't have so much faith in me." Isn't that wonderful? But then, with all our willpower, moment to moment, I sometimes say, do your dharma in a vacuum. But by that I mean, you might not have any idea where you're going. The little bird says, "How can I fly in this darkness?" And the night says, "Surrender to me. Peace awaits you in the unknown." Sometimes it's really way more than we can handle. So then what we just have to do is on moment to moment. I think I'll just be mindlessly cheerful right now. Okay, that worked for 60 seconds. So now I'll be mindlessly cheerful right now, because the right thing to do is have faith. And even if I'm flying in the darkness, I'll say, "Okay, Lord, I'm pretty much at the bottom of my strength, and I really don't know where we're going, but right now I'll just smile a little." Master said, last word before I stop. Master said, if you don't feel like smiling, he said, stand in front of the mirror and lift the sides of your mouth. He said, it's that important. He said, whenever you become discouraged, Satan has a hold of you. Whenever you feel that lift in your heart, then in that moment you are with God. So, God bless.